This series is based on a true story. It happened in McKinney, Texas. On Friday, June 13, 1980, something terrible happened in the home of Betty and Alan Gore. 2 years earlier, in September 1978, Candy Montgomery sang in the church choir. Later, she and her husband Pat had lunch with their friends, the married couple Betty and Alan Gore. At some point, Betty whispered to her husband that it was time for them to go because according to her schedule, she would soon be at her peak fertility. The couple wanted to have a child. Candy is a happy mother of 2 children, a daughter and a son. She was visited by her close friend Jackie Ponder, who was devastated by her husband's intention to file for divorce. For a religious woman, divorce is inappropriate. Candy comforted Jackie, promising to help her get through this difficult period. Betty is unhappy that her husband is going on another business trip. Alan said it was only for 4 days. Betty in turn began to blame him for her not being pregnant yet. Soon the head of the church council announced the divorce of Jackie and Bill Ponder, asking the congregation to keep their moralizing to themselves. Jackie is actively involved in the church and deserves support, not condemnation. On Sundays, the parishioners usually have a volleyball game, and this time was no exception. Betty did not participate in the game. Pat thought she didn't want to play because she was pregnant. This upset Betty even more, as she really wanted to be a mother again. Alan accidentally pushed Candy and then apologized to her for a long time. At that moment she felt a spark between them. In the evening at the bar, Candy shared this with her friend Sherry Kleckler. Candy wouldn't mind having an affair with Alan, and she was sure he wouldn't mind either. Sherry couldn't believe she was hearing such a thing from a married woman. Candy has a reputation as a pious housewife, so Sherry certainly didn't expect anything like that from her. The Montgomery family went to the movies. Pat is a good husband and father, but Candy can't stop thinking about Alan. She is actively involved in the life of the church community. Everyone loves Candy because she strives to support everyone. However, Candy's family life has long since turned into a routine. The former passion between her and Pat is gone. One evening after performing in the church choir, Candy saw Alan in the parking lot and gathering her courage, got into his car. At that moment Candy confessed that she felt attracted to him. Alan didn't know how to react, and Candy left. She couldn't believe she actually did it. Sherry thought it was reckless. Candy said she was tired of the monotony. While husbands go to work and build their careers, women are forced to do all the housework. This wasn't enough for Candy. Seeing their daughter Elisa dressed provocatively for Halloween, Betty scolded her. Alan thinks his wife is too strict about many things. Candy feels bored in her marriage. She wants more attention from her husband, but he is focused on other things. Pat also started thinking a lot about Candy. At work in the office, he even wanted to call her but managed to resist. In the evening when several married couples from the church were having dinner, Alan and Candy kept exchanging glances. Their mutual attraction was becoming obvious. After the Sunday volleyball game, Candy and Alan were chatting pleasantly as they walked to the parking lot. Since Betty wasn't at the game, Candy thought she might be feeling unwell. Alan said that his wife had been stressed lately. After that, he asked Candy what she meant during their previous conversation in the car. They got back in the car. Candy directly suggested that Alan start an affair. Alan really likes Candy, but he loves his wife and doubts he could betray her. Hearing that in the past when the Gores lived in New Mexico Betty had an affair, Candy was very surprised. Betty doesn't seem like a woman capable of that. Now Alan doesn't want his wife to experience the same pain he once did, especially since she is pregnant again. Candy understood. Suddenly Alan kissed her and wishing good night, got out of the car. The next day, Candy told her friend that she wanted something more with Alan. But she wasn't going to make the first move anymore. Halloween arrived. Children in costumes went house to house asking for sweets. Candy thanked Alan for walking with the kids. Alan wanted to feel Candy's interest again, but she no longer flirted with him and was just polite. On Candy's birthday she was visited by Jackie. The women had tea and cake, talking frankly. Jackie talked about her plans to move, where she had been offered a good job. Candy was very upset. Along with Sherry she considered Jackie her best friend. Their conversation was interrupted by a phone call. It was Alan, who suggested they have lunch together tomorrow and talk. Candy readily agreed. Jackie guessed that her friend was hiding something. Candy admitted that she wanted to have an affair. Jackie warned her that it wouldn't lead to anything good. However, Candy doesn't want to settle for what she has in her life. She is tired of living solely for the family and has already made her decision. The next day, Candy and Alan as agreed met at a gas station. Both were very nervous and felt awkward. Neither of them had ever cheated on their spouses before. They would have to be extremely careful so the truth wouldn't come out. They don't want to hurt their spouses but just want to enjoy life. Alan suggested thinking about it some more. He wasn't sure he was ready to take such a risk yet. Their lives returned to their usual routine. Alan made a list of reasons why he should have an affair with Candy. Sometimes they met at the gas station cafe and just chatted. At home, they continued to be exemplary spouses. One day Candy couldn't stand it and called Alan's office, saying she wanted an answer from him as soon as possible. In the evening after work during dinner, Betty asked her husband if he had made the list. Alan got nervous, but it turned out Betty meant a list of names for the baby. When meeting in person, Candy and Alan discussed the terms of their secret affair. They shouldn't take unnecessary risks, and if either of them started developing feelings, they would end it immediately. All expenses including gas, food and motels, would be shared equally. In the evening when Pat was watching TV and laughing loudly, Candy sat next to him and tried to start a conversation, but he didn't seem interested. Candy felt very upset. On December 12, 1978, Candy carefully prepared for her first meeting with Alan at a motel. When she was taking her daughter to school, she saw Betty. However, guilt did not take over. After that, Candy prepared lunch for Alan. Heading to the motel, she was nervous but also excited. The closer the moment of the meeting came, the more Candy was overcome with doubts. She called Alan from the motel and gave him the address. Alan replied that he would arrive in a few minutes. Like Candy, he was full of doubts. Meanwhile, she was setting the table. Alan would be here very soon. Putting on a beautiful nightgown, Candy asked her reflection in the mirror what she was doing. These minutes felt like an eternity for both of them. Once they crossed this line, they wouldn't be able to change anything. There was a knock on the door. Candy smiled at Alan and said that lunch was waiting inside. Alan in turn complimented her appearance. To relax, they had some wine and chatted. Not long ago, neither of them thought that something exciting could happen in their monotonous lives. Passion arose between them. When it was over, Candy said it was wonderful. But now they had to return to their families. Candy took a shower, in a great mood. She doesn't yet know that soon she will also be standing in the shower, washing away the traces of a terrible crime. Candy and Alan regularly saw each other during church choir performances and acted as if nothing had happened. Everyone had gathered in the church to say goodbye to Jackie, who was leaving. She was very touched and couldn't hold back her tears. There was a new pastor in their church, Ron Adams. Betty thinks Ron is unworthy of being a pastor because no normal person would come to church in a bright orange jacket. However, all the parishioners will have to put up with it. At some point, Betty noticed Candy and Alan looking at each other and smiling. But Betty thought it was because they were both on the church council, so they knew church matters and didn't share it with others. Candy and Alan's secret meetings continue. He shared with Candy that lately, Betty has become irritable and often clashes with the young pastor. Sometimes Alan feels like a terrible person because while his wife is pregnant, he is spending time with another woman. Candy and Alan held hands, promising each other that they would not let their spouses experience pain. Meeting with Sherry at a cafe, Candy shared her impressions about her affair. Although Alan is not particularly attractive, she is drawn to him. Sherry is even a bit envious, but she wouldn't have the courage to do such a thing. The Gore couple visited the ultrasound doctor, who advised Betty to be less nervous. However, she continued to be irritable about everything. Now housework no longer burdens Candy as it used to. She lives in anticipation of each meeting with Alan. One day she asked him to tell her about Betty's affair, because it was so unlike her. Alan said he didn't suspect anything until the last moment, but Betty couldn't stand it and confessed everything herself. She never liked that her husband was always away on business trips. Unexpectedly, Candy suggested Alan go on a roller coaster. They had a lot of fun at the amusement park. Soon, a party was held at the Gore's house in honor of the upcoming baby. Of course, Candy was here too. The women gave Betty cute gifts. The parishioners do not respect the new pastor and are not shy about showing it. Later, Alan told Candy that Betty plans to leave the church. Betty will give birth soon, so Alan will have to be home more often. Candy understood. She doesn't plan to ruin Alan's marriage, but on the other hand it hurts her to realize that they will see each other less often. The last thing Candy wants is to fall in love with Alan, but it seems that's exactly what's happening. At home, Candy as always becomes a model wife, taking good care of her children and husband. Her marriage to Pat seems exemplary. Meanwhile, Betty's dislike for the pastor is growing, and she uses every opportunity to show it. Alan shares all his worries with Candy. He is sure that after the birth, Betty will become calmer. Suddenly Candy declared that she couldn't handle her feelings for him. She was afraid for herself and her family. Alan realizes that every time they meet, they are taking a risk, but at the same time he doesn't want to break up with Candy. She has brought something into his life that he was missing. Their affair has helped his marriage because he feels better. Soon Betty gave birth to a healthy daughter. Alan and Betty were happy, but his secret relationship with Candy continued. They led a double life. To celebrate the birth of their daughter, the Gores threw a party. Candy held little Bethany in her arms. Later, Candy congratulated Alan on the birth of the daughter. He said that they were planning to go to Kansas for a week to visit Betty's parents. This meant the next secret meeting would not be until Thursday. Candy tried his best not to show his disappointment. Betty's parents were very happy to see her family, while Candy continued to live a routine life with her husband and children. All this time she couldn't stop thinking about Alan. Soon the Gores returned. At the first opportunity Alan met with Candy. Pat noticed positive changes in his wife. Often he forgets how beautiful she is. Betty wants attention from the husband. After being refused she cried, thinking that Alan no longer loved her because of her weight gain. Later, Alan discussed this with Candy. He loves his wife but spends all his energy on Candy. Perhaps they should break up. Candy reacted very emotionally to this suggestion. Alan tried to explain to Candy as calmly as possible that their affair was negatively affecting his marriage. What was happening was wrong. Candy tried to return to her usual life, but now she had nothing that truly made her happy. In September 1979, she received a call from Alan after a long separation. Alan missed Candy very much, as she missed him. His relationship with Betty had worsened. The good news was that Alan got a new job. When he suggested having lunch, Candy agreed. Alan shared the problems in his marriage. He and Betty were going to start attending special therapy for married couples. Maybe it would help them. Candy agreed to look after their children while they were away for a few days. The Gores arrived at the place where the group therapy would take place. Many couples with similar problems had come here. The purpose of the therapy was for spouses to speak as openly as possible with each other. The Gores checked into a room. All this was new to them, but for the sake of saving their marriage, they were ready to take this step. Candy shared with Sherry that jealousy is unbearable for her. While Alan and Betty were working on their marriage, she had to look after their children. Sherry suggested her friend go to a nightclub tonight to take her mind off things. The open conversations required by the family therapy program helped Alan and Betty deal with the problems in their marriage. For the first time in many months, they were living as husband and wife again. Meanwhile, Candy and Sherry were having fun at the nightclub. Candy was wearing a stunning glittery dress. Betty and Alan looked happy. Upon their return they renewed their vows, sealing their union in heaven. For them, it was like a second wedding and a second chance at happiness. It was painful for Candy to see Alan happy in his marriage, but she tried not to show it. Betty still suspected nothing, as Candy was behaving as usual with her. It seemed their secret affair had come to an end. Alan was fully immersed in family life and didn't plan to risk everything for a meaningless affair. Candy felt a helpless anger. And as is well known, nothing is worse than an angry woman. Candy remained a good mother to her children. Sometimes she still saw Alan, but as friends. He shared that family therapy had really helped him and Betty. From now on, he wanted to be completely honest with his wife, which meant he had to forget about Candy. She promised not to bother him anymore if he truly didn't want her to. Nevertheless, it hurt Candy that in ending their relationship, Alan didn't think about her feelings. As Candy drove away she cried. At home, Candy decided to repaint the kitchen, as she always did when she was upset. Sherry suggested they start a home renovation business together. Candy's thoughts were still occupied with Alan. It was unpleasant for her to feel rejected. Feeling a pain in her chest, Betty became worried and consulted a doctor. The specialist reassured her, confirming that it was a benign growth and that there was nothing to worry about. However, Betty still couldn't stop feeling anxious. Mechanically performing her parental and household duties, Candy continued to think about Alan. Unable to bear it any longer, she called him and asked how he was doing. Alan told her that Betty had been diagnosed with a tumor. Even though the doctors assured that it was benign, they were still worried. Candy decided to visit Betty to offer her support. Betty appreciated the support but was surprised that Candy knew about the tumor from Alan. Alan came home from work and said hello to Candy. Betty invited her to stay for dinner, but she declined, saying she still had many household chores to do. Betty went inside, and Alan walked Candy to her car. They talked a bit, including about Candy's marriage. Betty watched them through the window and definitely didn't like what she saw. Candy can't accept that Alan belongs only to Betty. Pat, as usual, was watching his favorite TV show. Candy simply turned off the TV and stated that, like the Gores, she wanted to go to marriage therapy. Pat didn't understand why they needed it. He didn't see any problems in their marriage. Nevertheless, Candy insisted. Additionally, she was ready to support Sherry's business idea. Maybe this would help her forget Alan and move on. Candy started advertising their home goods boutique. Soon Candy and her husband attended marriage therapy. Candy didn't like that Pat couldn't express his feelings. Pat in turn said that he was a mathematician, not a poet. The whole therapy seemed foolish to him. Despite everything, the sessions helped them learn to listen to each other. Candy shared her experience with Sherry. She almost stopped thinking about Alan. Soon the Gores and the Montgomerys had dinner together. The routine conversations made Candy feeling genuinely bored. Later, Candy told Sherry that her feelings for Alan had disappeared. She used to think it would be hard to see him, but now everything had changed. Since Candy was away for a couple of days, Pat took care of the children alone, but it wasn't a burden to him at all. Later, seeing a love letter from Alan among his wife's mail, he learned about their past affair. Pat's world turned upside down. The next day, he went to Sherry's workplace at the nail salon and asked for a private conversation. Sherry assured him that there was nothing between Candy and Alan anymore and that it would never happen again. Pat asked Sherry not to tell Candy about their conversation. Candy was returning home in a great mood. She had missed the children very much. However, everything was overshadowed by a call from Sherry, who told Candy that Pat had found the letter from Alan and knew about their affair. Candy could barely control her emotions. All evening she was not herself, while Pat continued to pretend that everything was fine. Candy thought for a long time about how to start the conversation. Pat already realized that Sherry had told her everything. He was not good at expressing feelings, so he wrote a letter to his wife, where laid out his thoughts sequentially. Pat went to wait in the living room, and Candy read the letter and burst into tears. Pat also couldn't hold back his emotions. He blamed himself for everything, thinking he had been a bad husband to Candy. Finally, the spouses had an honest conversation. Candy said she was very ashamed and didn't want to hurt the family. Pat suggested that they leave the past behind. The spouses embraced. After this, their routine life continued, but Candy was constantly tormented by guilt towards her husband. Ron Adams was upset that fewer parishioners were attending church, and he was thinking about how to fix it. Betty, for example, had completely stopped coming to church. Friday the 13th of 1980 arrived. It was a festive day. Candy and Pat didn't mention her affair, living just as before. Candy had a million things to do today. Alan was going on a business trip. As usual, Betty was unhappy. Alan promised that soon they would go on a family vacation to Switzerland. Betty admitted that she might be pregnant again. She thought she couldn't handle another child, and needed her husband's support now, but he had to work for the family. Alan didn't mind at all if they had a third child. After saying goodbye to his wife and children, Alan got into a taxi. That same morning, Candy was reading the Bible to the children in Sunday school. Neither she nor Alan knew yet that this day would become a living nightmare. Many women envied Candy's boundless energy. It seemed she could be everywhere at once. Among other things, today Candy promised to take Elisa, the Gore's daughter, to swimming, so she went to Betty's to get a swimsuit. It seemed that Betty was happy to see Candy and allowed Elisa to go to the cinema with the Montgomerys today. The Gores had a new pet, a puppy named Cheeto. Candy was delighted with him. She also gave Betty the business card of her and Sherry's agency. Suddenly Betty asked Candy if she had an affair with Alan in the past. Candy did not expect such a question but did not deny it, assuring that it had been long over. With tears in her eyes, Betty asked Candy to wait a minute and went somewhere. Candy cried, deeply regretting the past. When Betty returned, she had an axe in her hands. Candy did not understand what was happening. She promised never to see Alan again. The tension in the air became almost tangible. Betty told Candy that she would never give her Alan. Candy wanted nothing more to do with him anyway. She only allowed herself to calm down a little when Betty put down the axe. However, it immediately became clear that this was just the calm before the storm. When Candy started to apologize again, Betty suddenly pushed her, repeating that Alan would belong only to her. Betty attacked Candy. A fight broke out between the women. Meanwhile, Alan was trying to call his wife. After some time, Candy left the Gore's house with wet hair and clothes. In a state of shock, she got into her car and, as she initially planned, was going to head to the mall to get a Father's Day card. Terrifying scenes still flashed before Candy's eyes. She had taken Betty's life and still couldn't believe it really happened. At home, Candy threw her clothes into the washing machine and showered thoroughly. Due to the shock, she was incapable of strong emotions. Then, putting on dry clothes, Candy went back to Sunday school. She had to act as if nothing had happened to avoid suspicion. Candy explained her tardiness by saying she had been chatting with Betty. It took immense effort for Candy to control her emotions. She just wanted to scream. In the supermarket with the children, she looked detached but did not let her emotions take over. At home, the first thing Candy did was make sure her clothes were washed. Then she called her husband and said that Elisa was going to the cinema with them today. The doorbell rang. Sherry stood on the doorstep, immediately sensing something was wrong with a friend. But Candy assured her that everything was fine. Alan, still on his business trip, was unable to reach his wife and started to get nervous. Candy, as she was supposed to, took Elisa to swimming. Then, while Alan was busy with his work, the Montgomerys went to the cinema. It was already evening, and Betty still hadn't answered the phone. Alan didn't know what to think, so he called his neighbor Richard, asking him to check on Betty. Of course, Richard agreed to help. He knocked on the door but no one answered. Maybe Betty had gone somewhere. After this, Alan called Candy and asked if she had seen Betty today. Candy replied that they had talked in the morning when she went to get a swimsuit for Elisa. Alan's worry increased, and he called Richard again, who returned to the Gore's house and found that the garage door was open, which looked suspicious. Other neighbors joined Richard. It turned out that the front door had also been unlocked the entire time. It became clear that something bad had happened. The men went inside and saw traces of a horrific crime everywhere. The Gore's little daughter was crying. Richard took the girl to his wife. Then the men continued to look around the house and found Betty lifeless in the garage. The phone rang. It was Alan. Jerry volunteered to tell him the terrible news. Alan just couldn't believe what he heard. Jerry kept repeating how sorry he was. He wished he could find another way to say it. When Alan called Candy and told her that Betty had been found dead, she pretended to be surprised. Due to shock, Alan's voice remained calm. He asked Candy if Elisa could stay at their house for a few more days. Of course Candy didn't mind. Her tears were sincere. Alan couldn't make sense of what had happened. The police arrived at the Gore's house. The neighbors told how it had all happened. The crime had been committed with extreme cruelty. Only a true monster could be capable of such a thing. Alan contacted Sheriff Royce Abbott and said he hadn't been able to reach his wife all day. The only person who had been at the house today was Candy Montgomery, a family friend. There were no ideas about who might have wished harm to Betty. Candy was preparing breakfast when the phone rang. It was Alan, who had already arrived at the airport. Elisa still didn't know what had happened to her mother. Immediately after that, Candy received a call from Sherry, who was so shocked by Betty's demise that she was at a loss for words. The third call came from another woman from the church. It was already known that the crime weapon was an axe. Forensic experts concluded that the crime was spontaneous. The likely perpetrator is a woman, as the footprints on the floor were small. For Alan, everything felt like a blur. As he returned home by taxi, he saw that besides the police, neighbors and the press had gathered. This story had become a sensation. At home, Alan asked his neighbor Dick how everything had happened. Dick told him everything he knew. Alan blames himself. Betty never liked his business trips. If he had listened to her and stayed home, the worst might have been avoided. Elisa missed her father very much. The Montgomerys expressed their condolences to Alan. Now he had to tell his daughter the truth. At that moment Candy and Pat were by his side. In tears, Alan told his daughter that Mom would never come back. Unable to hold back, Candy burst into tears and hugged both of them. Everyone in town was gossiping about it. Many assumed that this was the work of a psychopath. Candy approached lawyer Don Crowder and asked for a private conversation. Since Candy was the last person to see Betty alive, she was to speak with the police today. Candy was worried about this. Don Crowder assured her that there was no reason to worry because no one would seriously suspect a fragile woman. A wake was held at the Gore's house. Only Candy knew what had really happened here the day before. Betty's mother, Bertha, tried to hold herself together. Candy, crying, offered her condolences. Candy was preparing for the upcoming conversation with the police. She decided to go to the station alone, without her husband. Candy told the detectives that she had seen Betty that day, but there were no alarming signs. Candy claimed she didn't know anything had happened until Alan called her. Candy knew she had to stay calm to avoid suspicion. The entire town was shocked by this tragedy. No one would have thought that anyone could want to harm Betty. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. The pastor delivered a long speech. Despite his conflicts with Betty, he had to fulfill his duty. Candy found it hard to keep herself under control. Alan told the detectives that his marriage had problems due to his frequent business trips. Betty didn't like it. Moreover, she had a short affair with a student, but that was in the past. According to Alan, he had always been faithful to his wife. At night, Alan couldn't sleep and eventually called Sheriff Abbott, confessing to his affair with Candy Montgomery. Pat couldn't help but notice that something was bothering his wife, although she denied it. Alan went to the police station and spoke with the detectives again. This time he told the whole truth. Alan loved his wife and never wanted a divorce. The affair with Candy was just a fling. Thus Alan became the main suspect in this case. The detectives read him his rights. Alan didn't try to resist. On the same day, Candy received a call from Detective Abbott, who asked her to come in to answer a few more questions. The police took Candy's fingerprints, saying they were taking prints from everyone who might have been in the Gore's house. After that, the detectives conducted an interrogation. Candy saw no point in denying that she had an affair with Alan. Now Candy became the main suspect. Hearing such accusations against her, she didn't react hysterically, which only reinforced the police's suspicions. If the jury learns that many of Candy's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, they will also deem her guilty. Candy continued to deny everything, stating that she wouldn't confess to something she didn't do. Then the detectives insisted she hand over the shoes she was wearing. The Montgomerys turned to lawyer Don Crowder. Candy directly said that 8 months ago she had an affair with Alan Gore. Don Crowder advised Candy to immediately call all the women from the Sunday school who could confirm that they saw her there that day. Another memorial service for Betty was held in Kansas. Her parents and her husband were broken. Afterwards, Alan talked to the police on the phone again. However, he had nothing more to add. Alan realized that sooner or later Betty's family would have learned the truth anyway, so he honestly told about his affair. Bertha couldn't understand how Alan could do such a thing. The worst part was that Alan's former lover had become the main suspect. The news was all about this. Sherry supported Candy and Pat during such a difficult time. Of course, the Montgomerys came under intense media scrutiny. On the advice of her lawyer, Candy did not speak with journalists. During a private meeting, Don Crowder asked Candy whom she was covering for. He was sure that Candy had something to hide. Suddenly Candy stated that she was the one who took Betty Gore's life, but in self-defense. Don was completely unprepared to hear this. However, regaining his composure, he told Candy not to discuss it with anyone but him. The next day, Alan and Candy underwent a polygraph test. Candy started smoking a lot, which Pat didn't like. He would have supported his wife to the end anyway, but he had some doubts. Perhaps the wife was not telling him everything. Although Betty didn't get along well with many people, the detectives had no reason to suspect that anyone wanted to harm her except Candy, who had a real motive. Of course, Sherry didn't believe in her friend's guilt. Everyone loved Candy, who was always actively involved in the life of their church. However, the same could not be said for the police. Candy received a call and learned that a warrant for her arrest had been issued. The bail amount was already set. Upon learning of his wife's arrest, Pat immediately left the workplace. Sherry was driving Candy to Don Crowder's office. Naturally, she was going to surrender voluntarily. Don was going to defend Candy in court along with his colleague, Robert Udashin, who specialized in criminal law. It was now important for them to keep a cool head. The story of the housewife with an axe continued to be actively covered in the press. Judge Tom Ryan called Don Crowder and insisted that Candy be delivered to the police station right away. Don could no longer stall. Robert, who drove Candy, assured her that there was nothing to worry about. After posting bail, she would be released. The press had already surrounded the police station. Candy was charged and arrested. The lawyer was not allowed to accompany her. Candy went through all the standard procedures. Learning that the judge had refused to accept bail due to the severity of the crime, Pat didn't know what to do. Don needed time to influence this. Alan followed the news of the case on television. He still blamed himself. Could Candy really be capable of such a thing? His thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell. Elaine Williams, an old friend, was standing on the doorstep. She brought Alan something to eat. Don made a statement to the press, not shying away from his words. The defense insisted that the police had fabricated the evidence, while the press continued to portray Candy as a monster. Pat didn't know how to help his wife. Meanwhile, Don Crowder instructed Candy to lose weight so the jury would believe she couldn't have attacked Betty. She should also change her hairstyle to a more conservative style. Don would personally choose Candy's outfits for the court hearings. In the eyes of the public, she needed to appear as a gray housewife. Candy was eventually released on bail. She refused to discuss the details of the case with her husband because that's what the lawyer advised. The spouses needed to support each other to get through this. Don Crowder called the pastor and said that if Candy were found guilty, it would destroy the church's reputation. That's why Ron Adams had to give the perfect characterization of Candy. 2 weeks later, the first court hearing took place, which Candy did not attend. Judge Ryan explained that playing games with the press was unacceptable, and that included the lawyers. Don Crowder behaved insolently with the judge and received a warning. Also, because of Don's behavior, Judge Ryan denied the motion to move the trial to another county. Of course, Candy was extremely upset. Jerry, who had come immediately after hearing about Betty's demise, was sure Candy was hiding something. Pat also felt that his wife wasn't being entirely truthful with him. Candy and Don planned to go to Houston to meet with renowned psychiatrist Dr. Fison. He might be able to help them win the case. Candy didn't like how everyone was staring at her. Pat demanded the truth from Robert, the second lawyer, but Robert refused, citing confidentiality. Dr. Fison hypnotized Candy, asking her to recall that fateful day. Crying, Candy screamed that she didn't need Alan and that Betty should stop touching her. Candy's emotions were running high at this point. Don was about to interrupt the session, but Dr. Fison gestured for him not to interfere and asked Candy to recall her childhood. Her emotions intensified. Don was astonished. To prove that Candy wasn't faking, the doctor told her she wouldn't feel pain in the next moment. Indeed, Candy didn't feel the needle pricks. This session confirmed that Candy wasn't a psychopath. She just snapped. That evening at dinner, Pat asked his wife what she had talked about with the doctor. Candy avoided answering. After the hypnosis session, she was surprisingly calm. The phone rang. Pat picked it up. It was Don Crowder, who thought Pat should know the truth. Listening to Don's words, Pat was speechless from shock. October 1980. Today begins the jury selection for the trial of Texas housewife Candy Montgomery. Sherry visited the Gores before the upcoming trial. Both Candy and Pat are very nervous. Sherry, who remains a good friend to Candy, will look after their children. Pat is not allowed to attend the trial. The press is closely following all the events. On the way, Candy asked Robert what it's like in a women's prison. He said it's better not to end up there. Candy took a long time to gather herself before getting out of the car. She was immediately surrounded by journalists. The court's task is to select 12 impartial jurors who will deliver a verdict based on the evidence and only on the evidence. Don Crowder gave a speech, announcing that Candy Montgomery had taken Betty Gore's life, which shocked everyone. According to the lawyer, Candy acted solely in self-defense. After this, Don gave a brief comment to the press. He is counting on the pastor's assistance, and Ron Adams is ready to help. Don also advised Pat to mentally prepare for the attention from the press. Pat is not very pleased that now the whole country will know that his wife was unfaithful to him. Betty's parents took the news very painfully that according to Candy, Betty was the first to attack her. Alan is no less puzzled. Betty's father Bob Pomeroy intends to come. Dinner at the Gores' house was held in silence. The first to break this silence was the daughter, who said that some of her friends wanted to dress up as her mom for Halloween. The conversation was interrupted by a doorbell. It was Jackie, who wanted to talk to Candy alone. Jackie does not believe that Betty was the first to attack Candy. She is not going to support her former friend in court. The second court hearing took place. Judge Ryan stated to Don Crowder that he had violated the court order prohibiting communication with the press. For this, he will receive a $100 fine and 24 hours in a holding cell. The serving of the sentence shall be deferred until the completion of the trial. The first witness was called, Alan Gore. He said that he could not reach his wife on that fateful day. Alan identified the crime weapon, his axe. Alan cannot say for sure whether Betty knew about his affair with Candy. Perhaps she might have guessed. This is exacerbated by the fact that Betty struggled with depression. According to Alan's assurance, there was no hot love between him and Candy, so he has no reason to believe that Candy wanted to get rid of Betty out of jealousy. Betty's father blames Alan for everything. If it weren't for his affair, Betty would still be alive. People in town gossip about Candy, but Sherry tries to stop it every time. Despite everything, she believes that her friend did not want to harm Betty. Candy baked delicious buns for her husband and children. Before dinner, they said a prayer. Pat doesn't understand why he can't attend the trial. Candy irritably reminded him that it was the lawyer's decision. At the next court hearing, the Gores' neighbors who discovered the body testified. Then the women from the church testified. According to them, Candy behaved quite normally that day. Candy is being hounded by the press. She looks surprisingly calm. In the car, Don asked Candy why she looked like a zombie. Candy admitted that she took a sedative because she couldn't take it anymore. Don told her not to do that again. If she doesn't show emotions, the jury might think she's a soulless monster, which will definitely not work in their favor. Pat tries to support his wife. He is just glad that Candy didn't end up in Betty's shoes, who was much bigger than her. Now they both need to be on the same side. Ron Adams gave a comment to the press, as did Don, who again violated the court's ban on communicating with the press until the end of the trial. At the next hearing, the detectives testified. According to them, Betty had defensive wounds on her hands, so it's obvious she tried to run away. It's not possible to say for sure if she was holding the axe. One thing is clear, the crime was not premeditated but spontaneous. The press used many facts to portray Candy as a monster. Don understands that their self-defense version cannot explain the 41 blows. Once the medical examiners testify, it will guarantee a life sentence for Candy. Against her lawyer's advice, Candy took a sedative again. Don urged her once more not to do that. Soon Candy will have to testify, so her mind needs to be clear. Alan often replays the day when Candy suggested they have an affair. If he had refused, everything would be different. At the next hearing, the forensic experts testified. The jury was shown gruesome photographs from the crime scene. Hearing the horrifying details, Bob Pomeroy broke into tears. While the expert continued answering the prosecution's questions, Candy struggled to remain calm. The expert stated that he had never encountered such brutality before. Next, the word has passed to the defense. Candy was in a difficult position, and Don Crowder tried to salvage the situation. The expert did concede that it could not be ruled out that Betty Gore might have attacked Candy Montgomery first. It was now Candy's turn to testify. Don Crowder requested the judge's permission to postpone this until tomorrow, as Candy was not in the best state, but Judge Ryan only gave them 10 minutes. Candy was well aware that her fate would depend on what she said. Don advised her not to omit any details. If anyone thought she was hiding, they would lose. Along with journalists, People with placards urging Candy to beg God for forgiveness gathered outside the courthouse. Candy returned to the courtroom. For her, everything seemed like a blur. According to Candy, her affair with Alan had already ended by that time. Candy then detailed the events of that fateful day. She had stopped by Betty's house to pick up a swimsuit for Elisa. At first everything was normal, but then Betty asked Candy if there was something between her and Alan. Candy replied that they had an affair, but it was long over. Candy was genuinely sorry, but this did not soothe Betty's rage. At some point, Betty went to the garage and came back with an axe. Candy didn't want to believe that Betty was seriously threatening her life. But when Betty attacked, Candy had to defend herself. Things went too far. Listening to this, Bob couldn't stop crying. Candy assured that she had no intention of harming Betty, it was simply what the circumstances demanded. When Betty stopped showing signs of life, Candy walked around the Gore house and then took a shower. At that moment Candy couldn't yet grasp what had happened. She only thought about behaving normally and doing all her planned tasks. At the trial, seeing the axe that was the crime weapon, Candy couldn't hold back and burst into tears. This was exactly the effect Don Crowder wanted to achieve. It was time for the prosecutor to ask questions. The prosecutor's primary concern was whether Candy thought about the Gore's little daughter as she left their house. Candy replied that she couldn't think about that. She only wanted to pretend that nothing had happened. However, this did not convince the prosecutor, and he showed the defendant exhibit number 13, a fallen lens from her glasses. This indicated that Candy's claim about Betty locking the garage and thereby cutting off her escape route was a lie. The attorney repeatedly objected, but the judge overruled each objection. The prosecutor concluded that Candy was a very good liar since she managed to deceive her close ones and all the churchgoers. After the hearing, Don and Robert argued about what to do next. They had overlooked one piece of evidence, the lens, and this could turn against them. Don decided that they needed to call Dr. Fison to testify in court. That night, Candy had a nightmare where the mother handed her a knife and told her to defend herself. Candy woke up in a cold sweat. Suddenly at midnight the doorbell rang. It was Don Crowder who said that plans had changed. Now the lawyer wanted the defendant's husband to testify as well. Pat did so, stating in front of the jury that he had forgiven his wife for the affair. Pat was convinced that Candy had an affair with Alan primarily because she lacked a friend. She was not a cruel person and did not mean any harm. Dr. Fison stated that Candy likely acted in a state of dissociation. But this did not mean that Candy had a mental disorder. Don Crowder accused the judge of bias because when the prosecution called their witnesses, the court did not intervene. For this comment, Judge Ryan increased Don's fine by another $100 and extended his sentence to 3 days. Dr. Fison told the court about the hypnosis session with Candy. It turned out that in the distant past, Candy had already had episodes where she partially lost control in stressful situations. Additionally, Candy was a person who worried greatly about what others thought of her. Dr. Fison concluded that Candy Montgomery had no conscious intention of harming Betty Gore. The witness was handed over to the prosecution, which did not believe that Candy's uncontrollable rage justified her actions. During the break, Don told Candy that they had to do everything to make the jury sympathize with Betty as little as possible. Candy didn't like this, but it was their only chance of winning. Church members testified, describing Betty as not a very friendly woman. The pastor said she often snorted disdainfully during his sermons. In contrast, Candy was described by the pastor as cordial. For yet another insult towards the judge, Don Crowder was sent to the holding cell for a day, but Robert arranged for his colleague to be released earlier than the set term. Not everyone believes it's right for Don Crowder to make Betty look bad in court, because she certainly didn't deserve it. But Don is just doing his job. Watching the news on TV, Alan didn't know what to feel. Did Candy really act in self-defense? Could Betty have attacked first? Alan turned off the TV. He is now supported by Elaine. He cannot be in court until the closing arguments, so the TV is his only source of information. Alan feels guilty. If it weren't for his affair, nothing would have happened. Elaine said he couldn't have foreseen this and kissed him. Don Crowder is preparing for another hearing. He is determined to win. In court, he stated his view of events. Candy had no plans to harm Betty. Until Betty lost her temper, Candy showed no signs of aggression. In a critical situation, Candy committed the crime under the influence of adrenaline. The lawyer is convinced that a guilty verdict in this particular tragedy is not the right decision, unlike the prosecutor, who believes that Candy Montgomery should be fully held accountable for her actions. 41 blows don't look like self-defense. Everyone is wondering what the outcome of the trial will be. Alan put himself in the hands of fate, believing that whatever happens will be for the best. Until the verdict is delivered, the Montgomery children will stay with Sherry. Candy can't wait for all this to be over so they can finally return to normal life. However, Pat believes that they have no chance for a normal life here. If Candy is acquitted, They should move out of McKinney immediately. The next day, it was revealed that the jury had finished their deliberations ahead of schedule. This made Dawn Crowder anxious. Soon the judge prepared to announce the sentence. Candy closed her eyes, trying to cope with her anxiety. The judge ordered her to stand and read the verdict, declaring Candy not guilty. Neither Candy, nor Alan, nor the prosecutor could believe it. Candy and Pat hugged in the courtroom. As they were leaving the courthouse, journalists bombarded them with a million questions. 8 days later, the Montgomery family was getting ready to move to Georgia. Sherry came to say goodbye to her friend. Sherry was one of the few who had supported Candy all this time. Candy also wanted to say goodbye to Alan and ask for his forgiveness. She truly did not want things to end this way. Alan was ready to forgive Candy. They wished each other happiness in life. This made Candy feel relieved. Now she was ready to start fresh with her husband and children.